The road to change. Tina Jones had always kept a cool exterior, a persona carefully crafted over years of rising through the ranks of corporate America. But tonight, as she sat behind the wheel of her car on an empty, dimly lit highway, she couldn't help but feel the familiar tightness in her chest. The flashing lights of the police cruiser in her rearview mirror were nothing new to her. It had happened before, officers pulling her over for no good reason, treating her as just another statistic, a woman of color they could intimidate without much thought. Tonight, however, things were different. Tina had never been one to back down from a challenge, but tonight, she was more than just an assertive woman driving through the night. Tonight, she was about to face something far greater than an inconvenient traffic stop. Tonight, she was about to be confronted by her past, her present, and the realization that change was coming for all of them. As the officers approached her car, Tina took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. She had prepared for this moment for years, but even then, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her promotion to the new head of the city's police department had been a contentious one, especially in a field traditionally dominated by people who didn't look like her. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated it would come in the form of two officers stopping her on a dark, deserted road. The older of the two officers, a man named Porter, approached her window, his posture stiff and his hand resting on his holster. His partner, younger and more nervous, stood a few steps behind him. Tina could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up, as if already deciding she was guilty of something they couldn't yet name. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," Porter commanded, his voice harsh, as if he were dealing with a suspect rather than a fellow professional. Tina's gaze remained steady, her face expressionless. She knew exactly how this moment was going to unfold. But she also knew that, for the first time in her life, she held a power that would change everything. "You can't be serious," Tina muttered under her breath, keeping her voice low. She had a right to remain calm, to not let the situation escalate, but the weight of the injustice hung over her. This was no ordinary stop. This was a test not only of her composure but of the system she had spent years fighting to improve. With deliberate slowness, she reached for her documents, handing them over to Officer Porter. He snatched them from her with a lack of courtesy that only fueled the simmering anger inside her. Tina's eyes never left his face, her grip on the situation unwavering. Porter mumbled something to his partner as they turned away, headed back toward the cruiser. Tina could feel the tension mounting in the air, the discomfort of two officers who had no idea who she really was. They didn't know they were facing their new boss tonight. And they wouldn't learn it in the way they expected. As she waited, Tina couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for people to realize who was in charge now. It wouldn't be easy. She had already faced pushback from many corners of the city, but this stop felt personal. It felt like an obstacle that she would have to dismantle, piece by piece. "Do you pull everyone over like this, or am I just lucky tonight?" Tina called out, her tone calm but carrying an underlying challenge. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. This was her moment. Porter stopped in his tracks, turning to glare at her. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across his features. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. Tina's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was little humor in it. "You know exactly what I mean," she replied, her voice low and steady. "You're treating me like any other woman of color you think you can intimidate. But I'm not just any woman, officer. And you will come to know that soon enough." The words hung in the air as Porter and his partner exchanged glances. For a moment, Tina could almost hear the wheels turning in their heads. They were trying to place her, trying to figure out what she was getting at. But Tina was already a step ahead of them. She wasn't just another driver. She wasn't just another woman on the side of the road. She was Tina Jones, the newly appointed chief of police for the city. And soon enough, these officers would realize they were about to be faced with a new era of leadership, one that demanded accountability, fairness, and respect for everyone, no matter their race or gender. As Porter turned to head back to the cruiser, Tina couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction wash over her. They had no idea what was coming for them. The power shift. Tina Jones sat quietly in her car, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise deserted street. She could still hear the retreating footsteps of the officers, the soft thrum of their cruiser as it pulled away from the shoulder. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with something unseen, like the stillness before a storm. She had stood her ground, but more than that, she had taken control of a moment that could easily have slipped away unnoticed. She looked in the rearview mirror one last time before shifting the car into gear and driving off. The city lights gleamed in the distance, a reminder of the work that lay ahead. But that wasn't the only thing on her mind. It was what had just happened. The interaction with the two officers wasn't just a mere traffic stop, it had been a symbolic act, an unofficial announcement that things were about to change. For the city, for the police department, and for everyone who had ever doubted her. Tina knew that the journey she had embarked on to become chief of police hadn't been an easy one. It had been marked by constant hurdles, each one more daunting than the last. Even when she had ascended through the ranks, there had been moments when it felt as if the weight of history itself was bearing down on her. Every step she took forward felt as if she was being pulled back by unseen forces, forces that didn't want to see someone like her at the top. But here she was, now holding the highest position in the department. She had proven herself time and again, not just as a capable officer but as someone who could bring change. However, the moment she had just experienced with those two officers was a stark reminder of how much further she had to go. The city had elected her for a reason. They saw the need for transformation. The old guard, the ones who refused to accept change, still clung to their outdated notions of power, authority, and respect. They hadn't realized yet that the tide was turning. The days of unquestioned power dynamics and unchallenged systems were over. She had been given this opportunity to create a new future, but that didn't mean everyone would be on her side. She would face resistance. She would face skepticism. And most of all, she would face people like Officer Porter, who believed their experience and their position made them untouchable. But Tina wasn't intimidated. She was fueled by the knowledge that the city had already made its decision. They had chosen her to lead, and now it was time to show everyone that leadership was not about who you were, but about how you served the people. As she made her way back toward the heart of the city, Tina couldn't shake the conversation she'd had with the officers. There was a part of her that felt the sting of their unspoken bias. Even after all her years of dedication, they still saw her as an outsider. They still assumed they knew who she was based solely on the color of her skin and the fact that she was a woman. It wasn't the first time this had happened. It had happened in small ways all throughout her career. She had often been the only woman, or the only person of color, in the room. Her ideas had been dismissed, her opinions ignored. She had learned to navigate those moments with grace, to stay the course, and to let her work speak for itself. But tonight, something inside her had shifted. Tonight, it wasn't about just brushing it off. Tonight, she had reminded them that change was inevitable, and they would have to face it whether they were ready or not. Tina's phone buzzed on the seat beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the message from her assistant, Jenny. Meeting with city council members tomorrow at 9 a.m. They're all on edge after the announcement. You ready for it? Tina smiled, a soft, determined smile. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The meeting tomorrow wasn't just a routine briefing, it was a chance to set the tone for the future of the department. She could already anticipate the questions they would ask, the doubts they would express. But she wasn't worried. She had come prepared. She had a vision for the future of the city, and she knew how to communicate it. She was ready. Tina had earned her place, and now it was time to show everyone that she was not just a token hire. She was a force to be reckoned with. The next morning, Tina stood in front of the glass windows of her office, gazing out over the sprawling city. The sun had barely risen, but the streets below were already bustling with the usual morning activity. To most people, the city looked the same as it always had. The same cars, the same people, the same routine. But to Tina, everything was different now. She was different. The lens through which she viewed her world had shifted. She no longer saw herself as a participant in a system that had been designed to keep people like her out. Now, she saw herself as the architect of a new future. Her office, still fresh and bare of personal touches, was a symbol of the change she had promised. Everything about it screamed possibility. The walls were clean, the furniture new, but there was a palpable energy in the room. It felt like something was about to unfold here. And Tina was determined that when it did, it would be for the betterment of the entire city. She checked her watch. The council meeting was in less than an hour, and she could feel the nerves starting to settle in. It wasn't the kind of nervousness that came from uncertainty or fear. No, this was a different kind of energy. This was the anticipation of a challenge she knew she could face head-on. The council members had made it clear they were skeptical of her appointment. She had been handed the position not through typical channels but because the city had demanded it. The old guard in the department had fought against it, and many members of the city council had been hesitant to support her. It wasn't just about race or gender, it was about control. The system had always been in the hands of a select few, and now, someone who didn't fit their mold was taking charge. They were worried about what that would mean for their influence, for their status. But Tina wasn't there to placate them. She wasn't there to win them over with pleasantries or empty promises. She was there to show them that leadership wasn't about what they had been accustomed to. It wasn't about protecting their interests. It was about serving the people. It was about integrity, transparency, and a commitment to justice. Her assistant knocked softly on the door before stepping in. Jenny was young but sharp, and Tina had come to rely on her instincts. "They're ready for you," Jenny said, her expression unreadable. She always kept her emotions close to the chest, which Tina appreciated. She didn't need anyone second-guessing her in a room full of uncertainty. Tina nodded and took one last look at the city below. She could do this. She had already done so much to get here. She had faced bigger battles, both inside and outside the department. This was just one more step in the right direction. When she entered the meeting room, the tension was immediate. Every eye in the room seemed to focus on her as she walked toward the head of the table. Tina could feel their gazes lingering, their judgment already formed. They were waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to prove them right, to show that someone like her couldn't lead. But Tina didn't stumble. She walked with confidence, taking her seat at the head of the table. She didn't need to speak yet, her presence alone was enough to make a statement. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I know there are concerns. I know there are questions. But I'm here today not to justify my appointment. I'm here to tell you that change is not optional. It is necessary. And it will happen with or without your approval." The room went silent. This was the beginning. The challenge ahead. Tina's words echoed in the silence of the room as she took her seat at the head of the long, polished table. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken doubts and skepticism. She could see it in the eyes of the city council members who were seated around her, some leaning forward with folded arms, others sitting back, arms crossed, as though bracing themselves for an argument. But Tina wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to beg for their approval or to meet them halfway. She was there to demand respect, for herself, for the community she had sworn to protect, and for the city that had entrusted her with the responsibility to lead. For the first time in a long while, Tina felt the full weight of the position she had earned. She had known that the climb to the top would be difficult, but now, sitting across from the people who had the power to shape her tenure, she realized just how daunting the task ahead would be. The stakes had never been higher. This meeting wasn't just about making decisions for the police department, it was about reshaping the entire landscape of the city, and every council member in that room had a stake in what would come next. Some of them wanted to see her succeed, but others wanted to see her fail. The room was quiet for a few long moments, until the mayor, a middle-aged man named Edward Hall, cleared his throat and leaned forward. He was one of the more neutral voices in the room, someone who had supported Tina's appointment publicly but had remained largely silent when the issue came up behind closed doors. He had been the one to push for reform, to champion a new era of leadership, but now that it was here, he was unsure whether the changes Tina promised could be executed in the face of so much resistance. "Tina," he began, his voice calm but cautious, "we've heard your vision. We've heard your ideas for reforming the department. But you must understand, the challenge ahead isn't just about policies and new strategies. It's about changing the culture of an entire institution, one that has existed for generations." Tina met his gaze, unwavering. She had already anticipated this argument. She had heard it before, many times, from people who didn't want to believe that change could be real, that it could be lasting. They often used the same excuse: the culture of the police department was too ingrained, too traditional, to be altered in any meaningful way. "I understand the challenge, Edward," Tina said, her voice steady and resolute. "But I'm not here to preserve a culture that allows corruption to thrive, that allows abuse of power to continue unchecked. I'm here to dismantle the systems that perpetuate fear and injustice. And that's not going to be easy, I know that. But it's what needs to happen." Several council members exchanged glances, some of them nodding subtly, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of her statement. Tina could see the flickers of doubt in their eyes. They hadn't expected someone like her to be so unyielding. She wasn't following the script they were used to, the one that demanded respect to be earned gradually, through compromise, through small concessions. But Tina had no time for that. The city had waited too long for change to come. And now it was her turn to lead it. "The department has been plagued by issues of accountability for too long," Tina continued. "I've seen it firsthand, I've lived through it. I've had to watch as officers who broke the law were protected because of their rank or their ties to the old guard. That will end. We'll be implementing new transparency measures, independent oversight, and, most importantly, we'll be creating a culture where justice isn't just a buzzword, it's a reality." The mayor nodded, but the unease in the room was still palpable. Council members shifted in their seats, some looking down at their notes, others avoiding her gaze entirely. They didn't fully understand what she was saying, but they could feel the weight behind her words. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a call to action. And they weren't sure they were ready for it. Councilwoman Sandra Mitchell, a long-serving member who had earned her position through years of political maneuvering, was the first to speak up. She was a seasoned strategist, known for being direct and blunt, and she didn't mince words. "I understand your passion, Tina," she said, her tone sharp. "But what you're asking for, reform of this magnitude, isn't something that can happen overnight. These systems are deeply entrenched. You can't just force people to change their mindset. It takes years, decades even. And let's not forget, there are a lot of people in this city, voters, taxpayers, who aren't exactly thrilled about the idea of a complete overhaul. You're talking about dismantling the very thing that many of them have relied on for years. How do you plan to handle that?" Tina let the question linger for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle into the space between them. She had heard the arguments before, and she knew that Sandra wasn't asking for the sake of genuine concern, she was testing her, trying to figure out if Tina was truly capable of the change she promised. "You're right," Tina said, her voice calm but unwavering. "This won't happen overnight. I never said it would. But I've been working on this for years, on understanding the problems, on figuring out how to fix them. This isn't about one big move, one flashy announcement. It's about the small, deliberate steps we'll take each day to rebuild trust, to re-establish the bond between the police and the people we serve. She paused, meeting Sandra's gaze directly. And as for the voters and taxpayers, I'm not going to promise them quick fixes. But I will promise them that I'll always be transparent. They will see the changes we're making, and they will understand that we're doing this not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. And if they want real change, they'll have to be part of it, too. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though some were still hesitant. The conversation was starting to shift. Tina could feel it. They were no longer talking about theory. They were talking about the reality of the changes she was proposing. Councilmember Thomas, a staunch conservative who had never been a supporter of Tina's appointment, finally spoke up. You speak of transparency, but what about the officers in the department? What makes you think they'll follow your lead? The police force is used to a certain way of doing things. They won't just bend to your demands, especially when they don't trust you. Tina's eyes locked with his, and for the first time in this meeting, she let the quiet intensity of her resolve come through. The officers in the department will either rise to the occasion, or they won't be part of the future of this city. We're going to hold them accountable. Every officer will be required to meet the highest standards of conduct, and if they can't or won't, they'll be removed from the force. The room fell silent again, this time heavier than before. It was clear that some were shocked by her frankness. There was no room for compromise in her words. There was no middle ground. This was a firm line in the sand. If they wanted change, it would be a challenge for everyone involved. But Tina was undeterred. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She had known from the very beginning that leading the department would be a battle. The weight of years of injustice, corruption, and bureaucracy would not be dismantled overnight. She couldn't change everything at once, but she could start the process. One step at a time. And as she looked around the room, she could see the shift beginning to happen. They weren't all convinced, not yet. But they were listening. And that, in itself, was progress. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, Tina said, her voice firm. And I don't expect everyone to embrace these changes right away. But you will see results. The people will see results. And this city, this department, will be stronger for it. The meeting continued, but Tina knew the most important conversation had already taken place. She had made her position clear. She had made it clear that change was no longer optional. It was coming, and it was coming fast. Now, she just had to lead them through it. Facing the resistance. As Tina walked out of the council meeting, the weight of the conversation still lingered, pressing down on her shoulders. The room had been divided, as she had expected. There were those who had quietly nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with reluctant respect for the stance she had taken. Then there were others who had made their discomfort clear, their crossed arms and furrowed brows speaking volumes about the uphill battle that lay ahead. Tina wasn't naive. She knew that leading the police department and transforming it from the inside out would be an immense challenge. The city had been accustomed to one way of doing things for so long that the very thought of change was met with resistance from all sides. Her task wasn't just to implement reform, it was to change the culture, to shift the mindset of a department that had been built on loyalty to the old ways. As she made her way back to her office, Tina's mind raced with the complexities of the situation. She had expected opposition, but the kind of pushback she had faced in the meeting had shown her just how deeply entrenched the old ways were. The system was resistant to change, not just from the officers who had spent their careers within its walls, but from the very people who had once claimed to want reform. The mayor had been supportive of her appointment, but his neutrality during the meeting had made it clear that he was waiting for results, not rhetoric. His cautious approach was understandable, but it also underscored the fact that Tina would have to prove herself at every turn. She arrived at her office, her thoughts still swirling. The room was quiet now, the blinds drawn, the space bathed in the soft glow of afternoon sunlight. Tina placed her bag on the desk, her fingers lingering on the surface of the smooth, polished wood. She had worked hard to earn this office, and she would work even harder to prove she was the right person for the job. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jenny. "We have a situation. Officer Porter has filed a complaint. He's claiming that you undermined his authority during your traffic stop last night. He's demanding a formal apology." Tina sighed, rolling her eyes as she read the message. She had known this was coming. Officer Porter was not the kind of man who took well to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Tina. The encounter had been uncomfortable for both of them, but Tina hadn't been interested in sparing anyone's feelings. She wasn't there to apologize for demanding respect. Her response was immediate. "Schedule a meeting with Porter for tomorrow morning. I'll address this head-on." As she set the phone down, Tina knew that this would be the first of many similar situations. Officer Porter's complaint was more than just an inconvenience, it was a warning. This was how the old guard would fight back. They would use their influence, their networks, to undermine her authority at every opportunity. They would challenge her decisions, test her resolve, and try to force her to back down. But Tina wasn't going anywhere. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The next morning, Tina walked into the conference room with a quiet confidence that surprised even her. The room was sterile, with a long table at the center and a few chairs scattered around it. Officer Porter was already seated at the far end, his posture stiff, his face betraying none of the tension he had clearly been holding on to since their encounter. He didn't look like a man ready to apologize, he looked like a man bracing for a confrontation. Tina took a seat across from him, her gaze steady. "Officer Porter, I understand you have concerns about how I handled our interaction last night," she began, her tone even but firm. She had no interest in getting bogged down in the details of his complaint. This wasn't about her. This was about the future of the department. Porter's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I've been with the department for 20 years. I've never had anyone speak to me like that, especially not someone who just stepped into their position." Tina leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more personal level. "I'm not here to apologize for what happened, Officer Porter. I am, however, here to explain why I handled the situation the way I did." Porter bristled, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. "I don't need an explanation. I need an apology. That's how respect works in this department." Tina remained calm, her gaze never wavering. "Respect is earned, officer. And I don't expect you to respect me just because of my position. But I do expect you to treat every person you encounter on the job with the same level of respect that you would expect for yourself. When you stopped me last night, you assumed I was just another driver, another woman of color on the side of the road. You assumed that I didn't deserve basic decency, and I won't stand for that. Not as a civilian, not as a colleague, and certainly not as your boss." For the first time since the meeting started, Porter's shoulders seemed to relax. He looked down at the table, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Tina could see the shift in him, the quiet realization that this wasn't going to be the same as before. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. But this was the beginning of something different. "I understand your frustration, Chief," Porter said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "I've been in this department a long time. It's hard to accept that things are changing. That we're changing." Tina nodded. "Change isn't easy. But it's necessary. And I'm not asking you to accept it overnight. I'm asking you to do your job with integrity, with respect for everyone, and with the understanding that we all have a responsibility to the people we serve. If you can't do that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." There was a long silence, and Tina could feel the weight of it settle between them. Porter had been a fixture in the department for years, a man who had risen through the ranks on the strength of his experience and his loyalty to the system that had always rewarded him. But now, that system was changing. And it was changing because of people like Tina, people who understood that leadership wasn't about maintaining the status quo, it was about breaking down the barriers that kept the department from truly serving the people. "I'll do better, Chief," Porter said finally, his voice a bit softer. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen again." Tina nodded once, satisfied. "That's all I ask, officer. That's all any of us should ask. We're all in this together. But the moment you forget that, the moment you stop treating people like human beings, is the moment we'll have a problem." Porter stood up, his movements stiff but respectful. "Understood, Chief." As he left the room, Tina sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. This was the first of many battles, and she knew that. But it was also the beginning of something far more significant. Tina was beginning to reshape the department, brick by brick, starting with her interactions with officers like Porter. She knew that it wasn't going to be easy. But she was determined to see it through. There would be more resistance, more complaints, more challenges ahead. But Tina was ready. And if she had to, she would fight for every inch. The department was changing. And so was she. Resistance and reinvention. The days following her confrontation with Officer Porter felt like a blur. On the surface, things appeared calm, but Tina knew better than to think that one meeting would be enough to shift the culture of an entire department. She had made a dent, yes, but it was only a dent. The resistance she had expected was beginning to show itself in subtler, more insidious ways. The murmurs in the hallways, the sideways glances from veteran officers, the backdoor conversations she wasn't part of, they all told her the same thing: change was not going to be easily accepted. But Tina had never been the type to back down from a challenge. And this was the biggest challenge of her life. She had known, when she accepted the position, that the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. She had known that people like Officer Porter, and others in the department, would push back against her authority, would test her resolve. But it wasn't just the officers she had to worry about. It was the culture, the mindset, that had been ingrained in the department for decades. The assumption that the police were above reproach, that the badge afforded an automatic sense of power and respect, regardless of behavior. Tina wasn't just battling individuals, she was battling an entire way of thinking that had been fostered for generations. As she sat at her desk, sorting through reports and strategizing her next steps, her mind kept returning to the same question: how could she get the officers to see her vision? How could she make them understand that the work she was doing wasn't about power, it was about responsibility? The answer came to her during a routine briefing with her deputy, Laura Williams, an officer Tina had known for years. Laura was sharp, dedicated, and had always been an advocate for reform. She was one of the few in the department who had openly supported Tina's appointment, and Tina trusted her judgment completely. "We need a plan," Tina said, pushing a stack of papers aside and sitting back in her chair. "A plan that goes beyond just policy changes. We need something that forces the department to confront its own shortcomings. Something that will make every officer here realize they're part of a system that needs to evolve." Laura, who had been flipping through the latest reports, paused and looked up at Tina. "You're thinking bigger than just internal policies. You're thinking about the public, right?" Tina nodded. "Exactly. If we want real change, we have to make the community a part of it. They need to see the shift happening in real time. We need transparency, accountability, and trust. And that trust has to be earned, not demanded." Laura leaned forward, her eyes lighting up. "What if we start by putting the focus on community engagement? Create programs that foster collaboration between the police and the citizens we serve. Have officers go out into neighborhoods, not just as enforcers of the law, but as active participants in the communities they're supposed to protect. Let the public see that we're not just here to patrol them, we're here to be partners in their safety. Tina thought about it for a moment. It was a bold idea, one that would require a complete mindset shift within the department. But it was exactly the kind of change that was needed. It would be a way to demonstrate that the police weren't separate from the community, that they were an integral part of it. That's it, Tina said, her voice firm with newfound conviction. We start with the neighborhoods. We get our officers out into the community, engaging with people in meaningful ways. Not just during a crisis, but as part of everyday life. This isn't just about patrolling, it's about building relationships. Laura smiled, clearly excited by the plan. I'll start putting together a proposal. We'll need to address how we can reshape officer training, make sure they understand the importance of building rapport and not just enforcing the law. Tina nodded. Make it a priority. If we can't change the culture of policing internally, then we'll change it from the outside in. The community will be the mirror that reflects our progress, or our failures. As the days passed, Tina and Laura worked tirelessly on the plan. They identified neighborhoods where the relationship between the police and the public was the most strained, where distrust and animosity had festered for years. The idea was to build community policing initiatives that focused on preventive measures rather than reactive ones. Officers would hold regular walks through neighborhoods, engage in casual conversations with residents, and offer resources for those struggling with mental health, addiction, or other challenges. But it wasn't just about putting together a proposal, it was about changing the hearts and minds of the officers who would be on the front lines of this effort. Tina knew that if the officers didn't buy into the idea, it wouldn't work. They had to feel that this wasn't just another program to tick off a box, it had to feel like a fundamental shift in the way they viewed their roles in society. And that's where the real challenge lay. A week later, Tina stood in front of the department's training room, looking at the group of officers seated before her. They had gathered for a special briefing, one that would lay the foundation for the new approach to community policing. She could feel the skepticism radiating from some of them, the old guard who had seen it all, who had weathered every political storm and remained unchanged. She could see the resistance in their eyes, but she also saw something else, curiosity. They were waiting to see if she was serious. I know many of you are wondering why we're here today, Tina began, her voice steady but full of purpose. You've heard the talks. You've seen the changes coming. You've heard the complaints, the criticisms, from the public. But I'm here today to tell you that we're going to make those concerns our priority. Not because it's politically correct, but because it's the right thing to do. She paused, allowing her words to settle. She could see them all watching her, waiting for her to falter, waiting for her to show any sign of doubt. But Tina didn't falter. She stood tall, unwavering in her conviction. Your job isn't just to enforce the law. It's to protect people, to serve them. And that means engaging with them on a human level. We're going to start making real connections with the communities we serve. We're going to make them feel like we're not just here to arrest them. We're here to help them. We're going to show them that we care. And I'm going to hold every single one of you accountable for this change. She could hear the murmurs in the room, the unease, the disbelief. They weren't sure if she could really pull this off. They didn't believe that a few friendly conversations with residents could undo decades of mistrust. But Tina wasn't asking them to believe her right away. She was asking them to trust the process. To be part of it. We're not doing this alone, Tina continued. I want you to partner with local organizations, with mental health professionals, with social workers. You'll have the resources to address the needs that go beyond what a police officer should handle. You'll be the face of the change you want to see. And if you can't get on board with that, then you'll be the one left behind. The room was still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see the shift happening, just a small one, but it was there. Some officers were nodding, slowly, as if they were beginning to understand what she was asking. Others still looked unconvinced, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Tina had planted the seed of change. Now, it was up to the department to water it, to nourish it, and to grow it into something that couldn't be undone. As the session ended, Tina stood at the door, watching the officers file out. She knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. But Tina was ready for it. She had the conviction, the vision, and the support to make it happen. Change wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it was happening, piece by piece, day by day. And this time, it was here to stay, the long road ahead. The weeks that followed the community policing briefing were a blur of activity. Tina's days were spent balancing meetings, overseeing departmental changes, and working tirelessly to ensure the new initiatives were implemented effectively. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated just how much it would take to shift the department's mindset. There were some officers who had embraced the community policing model wholeheartedly, eager to be part of something bigger than themselves. But there were others, many of them high-ranking officers, who were less than enthusiastic. The old guard was not ready to relinquish their power or the long-standing, insular culture that had defined the department for decades. Despite the opposition, Tina knew she couldn't afford to back down. This was not just about her. It was about creating a department that served the community, that could be trusted to protect and to lead with integrity. She wasn't just fighting to reform the system, she was fighting to change the very nature of policing itself. The first real test of her plan came a month into the initiative. One of the neighborhoods Tina had targeted for the community engagement program had experienced a spike in violent crime. It was a neighborhood that had long struggled with gang activity, poverty, and a strained relationship with law enforcement. The residents had grown accustomed to the presence of police officers, mostly as an occupying force rather than as partners. The idea of officers walking the streets, engaging with community members on a personal level, was something many of them didn't trust. But Tina had a plan, and it wasn't just about sending officers out into the streets without guidance. She knew that for the program to be successful, the officers had to be equipped with the right tools, tools that went beyond their badges and guns. They needed empathy, communication skills, and a deep understanding of the communities they were there to serve. Tina had insisted on incorporating social workers and community leaders into the training process, so the officers could approach situations with the awareness and sensitivity they had previously lacked. One evening, just as the officers were beginning to settle into their new routines, a shooting occurred in the neighborhood. The incident was violent and chaotic, and it was the kind of thing that could have easily sparked a violent clash between residents and the police. The old way of responding would have been to send in a large, heavily armed unit, creating an atmosphere of fear and distrust. But this time, Tina had a different approach. Instead of sending in an overwhelming show of force, she ordered her officers to approach the situation with restraint. She had already established a rapport with some of the community leaders in the area, and she called them in to assist. She knew that the only way to de-escalate the situation was to involve the very people who lived there, those who knew the residents, who could speak their language, who understood the deep-seated fear and frustration that had fueled the violence in the first place. It wasn't an easy decision. There were officers in the department who didn't think it would work. They believed that the only way to control the situation was to flex the department's muscle, to show the residents who was in charge. But Tina knew that the real test of her leadership wouldn't be about flexing muscle. It would be about proving that the police could be a force for peace, for resolution, not just for enforcement. When the officers arrived at the scene, they were not in riot gear, and there were no flashing lights or sirens. Instead, they walked calmly toward the crowd, speaking to the residents in a way that showed respect, in a way that let them know the police were there to help, not to control. The community leaders, whom Tina had been working with for weeks, were by their side, speaking directly to the people who had gathered in the street. The scene that unfolded was nothing short of miraculous. The crowd, which had initially been ready to riot, began to dissipate, calmed by the presence of those they trusted. There was no confrontation. There were no arrests. The situation was diffused not by the threat of violence, but by the promise of understanding, of cooperation. Tina watched the event unfold from her office, her eyes glued to the live feed on her phone. It was a moment that confirmed everything she had been fighting for. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was proof that the new approach could work. Her officers had engaged with the community, not as enforcers, but as partners. They had shown up to help, not to dominate. The success of that night was a turning point for the department. For the first time, Tina felt a collective sense of pride ripple through the force. The officers who had participated in the community policing initiative saw firsthand how their actions had made a difference. They had built relationships with the community, and in doing so, they had averted what could have been a violent confrontation. This was the future of policing, the idea that it wasn't enough to just serve and protect. It was about earning trust, building bonds, and making sure that every action taken was one that contributed to the community's safety and well-being. But Tina knew that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. The old guard was still resistant to change, and there were whispers within the department that she was softening the force. She had expected this, but it still stung. The officers who were used to operating under the old system, who believed that power came from authority, not respect, were the hardest to reach. But Tina was determined to bring them along. She couldn't let the small percentage of officers who were clinging to outdated methods dictate the future of the department. She had made too much progress to let them undermine it. The challenge was not just to change the culture of the department, but to change the way officers saw themselves. They were not just enforcers of the law, they were public servants. They were part of the community, and they had a responsibility to the people they served. One day, as Tina was reviewing the reports from the previous week, she received a call from an unexpected source. It was a local reporter who had been covering the changes in the department, and he wanted to know more about the success of the community policing initiative. Tina wasn't sure if she wanted to go public just yet. She wasn't ready for the attention that would come with such a significant shift, but she realized that this was another opportunity to reinforce the message she had been preaching. After a brief conversation, Tina agreed to meet the reporter at a community center in one of the neighborhoods that had been a part of the initiative. The visit would be a chance for her to speak directly to the public about the changes that were taking place, and to remind them that the department was committed to working with them, not against them. The day of the interview arrived, and Tina was greeted by a small crowd of community members who had come to show their support. She stood in front of a group of residents, with the reporter by her side, and spoke candidly about the department's goals and the importance of rebuilding trust between the police and the community. "This isn't just about policy," she said, her voice steady and confident. "It's about people. It's about making sure that every citizen in this city knows that they matter, that their voices are heard and their concerns are addressed. The police are here to serve, to protect, and to be partners in the safety of every single person in this community." The residents nodded, some of them smiling, others still uncertain. But Tina could see the change in their eyes. They were starting to believe that the police could be different, that the changes were real. As the interview ended, Tina stepped away from the crowd, feeling a sense of quiet pride. The work was far from done, and there were still many obstacles ahead. But the department was on the right track. And that, for now, was enough. The long road ahead would be full of challenges, but Tina was ready for them. She had started something that would outlast her, something that would change the future of policing in the city. And she was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took.